Hello and welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. It's great to have my monthly panel back with me, these three wonderful experts with lots of political experience. We have the Honorable Joe Oliver, a former Stephen Harper Government Finance Minister and Natural Resources Minister. We have the Honorable Gary Marr, a former provincial cabinet minister and a special representative of Alberta in the United States. And we have the Honorable Sandra Pupatello, a former provincial trade minister, now senator in Canada's Senate. Welcome to all of you.
Good
Gary,
afternoon.
With you.
it's great to have you guys here as usual. Gary, I'm going to start with you because one of the things that's happened over the last several days is this Alberta-Canada MOU, this natural resources memorandum of understanding, if I could call it that. There were some goalposts and milestones that were supposed to be met by April the 1st. They were missed. So what does that all mean in terms of this MOU and the development of our natural resources?
It's a really good question, but what I can say is that conversations are continuing to happen between the federal government and the government of Alberta. Most recently, in CERAWeek, both Premier Danielle Smith and Natural Resources Minister Tim Hodgson were in Texas, and they were both talking about this. And I would also say that Minister of Energy Brian Jean from the province of Alberta was also at CERAWeek, which is a large gathering of the energy sector. It appears that the Premier and Minister Hodgson feel that there is progress being made, and although a deadline of April 1st was not met, some progress has been made on a number of sort of big issues. One of them was really the issue of where the major projects should be reviewed, and those major projects that are within Alberta will now be reviewed in Alberta. That was a major stumbling block. Another one was the whole issue of being able to fix on a carbon price. You'll recall that the federal government had scheduled to take the carbon price to $170 a ton. The Alberta government currently has one at $90 a ton. Maybe there's a saw-off in between at $130, but there's no schedule for when that will be put in place, so that remains to be seen. Methane regulations, the province agreed to more stringent methane regulations, which is one thing that the federal government wanted. And so there's been compromise struck on that. And the fourth one, the big one, I think that is a challenge is with respect to the federal government's insistence that the Pathways project, which would cost somewhere between $15 and $20 billion to capture and store CO2 in the ground, that is a challenging one, and it remains to be seen whether that's a hurdle that can be overcome. But so far, there's been lots of goodwill expressed by both sides. And even Minister Jean was at the podium extolling what a great Minister of Natural Resources Tim Hodgson was. We haven't heard that from a Minister of Energy in Alberta for over a decade. That kind of glowing report. So perhaps there's still a deal to be done in spite of the fact that April 1 has come and gone.
We've got about a minute left. Sandra, are you worried about the state of this deal, or is there a lot of goodwill
Well,
still
I
there?
actually think it was such a great sign to see them working collaboratively and in Texas, where so many oil executives are, because I think the general view is that we need to get the private sector interested or reinterested to be potentially investing in Alberta. And that's a really great place to go and see if that's the case. And those oil companies would not have seen two ministers from the province and the feds in the same room at the same time for a very long time. So I'm hoping that they might notice that there's a different view, that they would be welcomed. And I think that may bring them. And I know that was the chief objective of the Premier of Alberta, was to find private sector interest again.
Right. All right, we're going to hear from Joe Oliver, but I'm going to take a little break first to give Joe a fulsome amount of time to comment on this issue and the issues to come. Stay with us. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Boom Bust. We have our monthly panel with us today. The Honourable Senator Sandra Pupatello is with us, the Honourable Gary Marr, who is now head of the Canada West Foundation. I should have mentioned that at the outset. And the Honourable Joe Oliver, of course, a former Minister of Finance. Joe Oliver, I wanted to go to you on this MOU deal. Missed a couple of deadlines last week. Are you concerned at all?
Well, yes, I am. I was concerned right from the beginning because the fundamental problem here is whether this is just performative art or the federal government really intends to do something in spite of not removing the regulatory and economic impediments to development. I think we're still left with a highly uncertain environment, and that's why Gwyn Morgan, the former CEO of Encana, has said that there's no way he or anyone he knows would invest the billions of dollars necessary to get a project going, presumably without any federal subsidy or de-risking of the project. Look, it's based upon an agreed objective of net zero, and that's why there is a need for carbon capture and storage, which is an unproven technique in scale. But we do know it'll cost some $15 billion and could render any project uneconomic, in addition to the uncertainty because of potential vetoes, which the Prime Minister said he would respect.
Mm-hmm.
The other part of it is carbon capture and storage only relates to the extractive part of the emissions from oil and gas. There is also, of course, the bulk of it. 3/4, perhaps maybe 80%, relates to the consumption of the oil and gas, in trucks, in cars, in industrial production, and so on. So this net zero objective is really illusory. And I don't know if it's just a performance or not, but it's nevertheless a very costly act that's being imposed. And I've been puzzled to some degree by the apparent enthusiasm of the Alberta government to all this. Is it that they're waiting to see whether the feds will actually move ahead and against the objection of environmentalists, the Green faction in the caucus, or and if so, will they be prepared to put the money on the line to de-risk the project sufficiently for the private sector to get involved, or is the Premier Danielle Smith merely waiting to see if that doesn't happen? She can then say, "Look, we gave it our all. We trusted they would deliver. We were enthusiastically supportive, and we have unfortunately been deceived." So we'll see how this plays out. But so far, let's face it, it's been all performance and no delivery.
I just wanted to add this to what Joe just said, and that's that we apply a net zero test for oil that we produce in Canada, but I don't see other countries doing the same thing, and nor do I see Canadian consumers concerned about whether oil that is imported to Canada, largely in Eastern Canada, is net zero. They don't care. And so it does place us at a huge competitive disadvantage if we go ahead with pathways and add cost to producing a barrel of oil.
And let me add something right now in the international geopolitical context. I mean, if ever there was a need for Canadian natural gas and oil, this surely is the time.
This is it,
And we're not there, absent without leave. It's a tragedy, We could have been playing in a very important supportive role. We could have been helping Asian countries and allies in Europe, but we haven't got the oil and gas, with one exception to Tidewater, and we just we're not there. And that says nothing, of course, about the hundreds of millions, really tens of billions of dollars in revenue, which could go into the private sector and into the public coffers for critical social programs.
Hello and welcome back. We're here with our monthly panel. We've got the Honourable Joe Oliver, we've got the Honourable Gary Marr, and the Honourable Senator Sandra Pupatello. Sandra, I'm going to come to you because what happened in the last few days is quite interesting. There was a little bit of a controversy in Ottawa recently about Canada's enforcement of forced labor laws vis-a-vis the Chinese, and this was tied into Chinese electric vehicles getting access to the Canadian market. I'd love to get you're a former auto executive yourself, so I would love to get your sort of take on all of this.
Well, I would say the news the last couple of days around Brampton and the site for Stellantis, Chrysler, that they have had and is now idled, trying to, at least some conversation, whether it's even confirmed at this point, that they would use that as a base to bring in essentially kits that would be reassembled into a vehicle, an EV, out of Brampton for sale in Canada. And I guess my initial concern there is that if we had to shoot for the moon, it would be to build a new assembly that the Chinese OE wants to come in and do, and then employ local suppliers. But when it comes in a kit, it's all Chinese. So I'm not sure that it would even meet our standards in terms of the amount of supply that has to be destined from Canada, and how we're going to do that. How is it going to pass safety regs? How is it going to be for sale that in that format? So I'm a little worried that because we know it's idled and we know there's job loss, that we start to settle for less than what we should be shooting for, which is an optimal investment in auto in Ontario. We are the best jurisdiction in North America, in my view, on a number of fronts. And the latest C-15 budget that was just passed puts even more incentive for investment in Canada. So I'm a little disappointed. I'm sure that our federal government is in constant discussions with Stellantis because we're watching them carefully. Their role with the new battery plant that was built in my hometown in Windsor, the use of outsiders on that front. It's kind of a recurring theme here that we need to keep pushing our colleagues in the automotive space to be looking at Canada as an appropriate investment, not just settling for, well, let's just do something there, but really employing local workforce with local supply chain so that we can build a proper Ontario vehicle. And they sell our cars. When we do build them, we do very well. You probably all already know that for Toyota, for example, the only place that they build a Lexus outside of Japan, which is their premier model, is right here in Ontario.
That's right.
And that just speaks to the kind of quality that we produce.
Joe, are you concerned about this in particular, about enforcement of forced labor laws and the Chinese EVs coming into our market?
Well, I think we talk about sort of two things the Prime Minister does in contradiction. Well, one is our values, and the other is to deal with the world as it is rather than how we want it to be. And what so what does that mean, really? I guess it means in this case we pick and choose. So one thing is this issue of a refusal now, not just a reluctance, a refusal to be publicly critical of China on its appalling treatment of the Uyghurs and others and sort of slave labor almost. That's one issue. Another issue is national security. I mean, I don't want to be paranoid, but when you bring in stuff that hasn't been inspected, what's contained in it that might compromise national security. And let me tell you, that's something the Americans will be extremely focused on.
Well, and I think
And
Joe's
frankly, so
correct.
should we. I'm not
Yeah.
saying there is an issue. I
Sure.
simply don't know.
Well, I
Yeah.
think we have to recognize too that the Americans are already on record that they would be very careful about what Chinese vehicle from Canada would even make it
Absolutely.
across their border. But
That's
in
right.
addition, Canada itself has the modernized Slave Act, which prohibits any of that along its entire supply chain. Their suppliers here in Canada, they have to sign on the dotted line that everything that they're bringing in as well is according to our law. So as much as I appreciate the committee in Ottawa and what they were discussing and who was asking what kind of question, we've got laws on the books in Canada now that prohibit any of that kind of affiliation with what's coming in here. So that makes me feel comfortable. And are certainly in the
Sure.
auto supply chain, they've had to do all kinds of work through the suppliers of their supplier to make sure that they are compliant with this legislation.
And welcome back to Boom and Bust and our monthly expert panel. I'm going to go directly to you, Gary Marr. We're talking about Chinese technology and impact and electric vehicles. I'd love to get your perspective on this.
Well, first of all, the number of vehicles that Canada is talking about bringing in is 49,000. That's not a significant number. You're not going to find, the big automakers like, BYD or Geely or Leap Motors or Chery wanting to come in to build a factory for 49,000 vehicles. It's just not going to happen. Further down the road, if there's an expansion, there's talk that it could move to 70,000 vehicles. That's still not a significant incentive to build. And so I would be thinking about this. Will there be factories with these major automakers setting up in Ontario? The short answer is no, not in the short term. On the issue of Chinese autos coming in, I think Joe alluded to this about, are there security issues? Are there data issues? It does remind me a bit of Huawei having their hardware that is now no longer being, installed in our telecoms system. It wasn't the handsets; it was the hardware for telecommunications. That's all now coming out of our telecommunications systems. It is something. It is a legitimate issue that the Canadian government would need to deal with in order to be satisfied that there won't be problems with such automobiles coming into Canada. And then the third piece is, on the issue of slave labor and such. I mean, I've been to some of these factories, and you would be shocked at how automated they are. There's actually very few people that are working in these auto factories. Now, can you say the same thing about the inputs? That part I don't know. I mean, is there aluminum being being smelted in slave labor conditions? I can't speak to that from firsthand experience, but I do know that the factories themselves are incredibly automated, very, very advanced in the actual assembly of an automobile. And there's probably things that we could learn from these processes. So we have to proceed cautiously with this. I think to have affordable EVs in Canada may be a good idea, but there are many, many legitimate considerations before we jump in entirely into buying Chinese EVs to be distributed all across Canada.
Sandra, any final thoughts on this topic?
No, I think, Gary, you summarized that very well. I think we do have to proceed with caution, and you've got to assume that an international company like Stellantis is looking at this. If they build it in Brampton, is it going to satisfy our safety requirements, which does take some time to get through? Where are they going to sell the vehicles? They can't just sell in Canada. They'll want to sell in North America, which means it needs to cross the border. Can they do that? What is their time frame? Will they meet requirements in terms of that investment? Is this going to satisfy the federal government in terms of Stellantis activity? Because remember, they've been handed a lot of money over the years, and they need to meet certain milestones milestones. And this may be part of a way that they feel that they can meet them. So that really is going to put more pressure on the federal government to take a keen look at how are they doing this. Local workforce, they're going to want more of a piece of this. And that means local suppliers are going to want to supply. And that may not be available if it's essentially a kit car. So I just wish we'd aim higher. And look, I don't want to see the idled plant in Brampton any more than the next. But it'd be nice to know that we can do something that's a little higher end in terms of impact on our economy.
Well, Sandra, you and I remember when we did give a packet of money to Chrysler as it was in. You and
I
you
think
and
that
I
was
are
the
working
moment we
together.
bonded. I think we bonded at that moment. It took a few billion to bond, but nonetheless.
Yeah. But
Well,
it was
we were
all
giving away money. You were on side, obviously.
Yes. I remember Stephen Harper on his 50th birthday turned to me and said, "If you would have told me I'd be giving billions of dollars to the auto sector on my 50th birthday, I would have said you were crazy." And yet there
Now,
we were.
Joe, we can be charming. We charmed them out of several billion for
Yeah,
Ontario. Yes, that was
exactly.
true.
Exactly.
And listen, to this day, we are still employing people as a result of that money. And they paid
Indeed.
it back sooner than planned, which was
Indeed.
another part of the story we need to remember.
Folks, that's
Yeah,
all we have time for today,
I sold
unfortunately.
it at a
Go ahead.
profit.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're gonna leave it at that, I'm afraid, but there's so much more to talk about. But the good news is we'll be back together in several weeks. But thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching today.